Hey guys, it's Nick. Welcome to another episode of T-365. If you're an MSP leveraging delegated access for automations in your downstream customer environments, or you're a vendor that integrates with Microsoft Graph API in the downstream customer environments of your partners, you definitely want to stay tuned because in this video, I'm going to be walking you through some breaking changes that are coming with GDAP and how you can fix those moving forward so that your automations don't break. And as a vendor, your integrations don't break whenever we have a hard cutover to GDAP in the coming month here or even next couple of weeks according to their timeline as far as today goes. So definitely stay tuned. I'll be walking through all that, giving you some video demonstration. And as always, if you like this content, go ahead and like and subscribe. Let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, so before we dive in here, just want to preface that this is a lot more technical of a video. There's a lot that I'm going to be covering here that can get highly confusing, but just note that I did supplement this with 2 blog posts, one for MSPs, one for vendors, that goes into the depth here of which I'm going to show you. So don't feel like you have to take a ton of notes or screenshots because I've already done that on your behalf. The other thing to note is that I am assuming that you have a fundamental understanding of GDAP. I've been blogging and posting about that for over a year now, so I'll link below my GDAP playlist as well. If you're not familiar, you can get up to speed there. I recommend doing that before diving into this video because that'll make this make a lot more sense. So before we actually get into demoing out what the actual steps are that you need to take here to be able to support GDAP and automations and delegated access, I quickly just want to touch on the point of why this is breaking your integrations or why this is breaking your automations. With the previous model, we had something called DAP, or Delegated Access Permissions, and this is basically granting us global admin rights into all of our downstream tenants that we have within our partner center, in Microsoft Partner Center environment. So whenever we added what was called an app registration, we were able to add that service principal, that app registration service principal, to the admin agents group in Partner Center, and that would then allow us to get access tokens and have grants to go into our downstream customer environment so that we could run scripts against them without having to sign into each customer. And as a vendor, you could do the same thing with calling Graph API calls, getting access tokens for those downstream customers in the MSP's environment. So the main thing that's changed here when we move to GDAP is that we're moving from this pre-consent model, meaning that as an MSP, if I have an app registration, the service principal, and my partner tenant, I automatically grant access to all my downstream customers if it's in that admin agents group. Now with GDAP, this is no longer the case as far as that pre-consent model. You basically have to say, I need explicit grant to this particular application that I've created, and this is what's going to give me that access into my downstream customer environments, and it makes sense with the security as it relates to GDAP in general. The basic model that we're talking about here has been coined as the secure application model with Microsoft because you're setting up this application registration with an account that is MFA enabled, and you have all these security requirements behind it to try to restrict the levels of access or at least lock it down some for the things that you were doing from an automation perspective. So the basic change here whenever we switch from DAP to GDAP is that pre-consent's no longer in place. So any type of automation you had with that app registration, whether as you being an MSP within your tenant or a vendor that's put an app registration within your tenant, the basic premise is that there's no longer that pre-consent happening, so you're no longer able to get those access tokens readily. There's more additional steps that you have to take, which is what we're going to be walking through in here just to make sure you check off all the boxes as far as the prerequisites. I'll recommend some best practices here from a security standpoint, from GDAP relationships in general. And additionally, at the end, I'll provide you some more helpful resources as well too. So let's go ahead and start with the basic prerequisites. And by doing so, let's step into the Azure Administrative Portal so I can begin walking through those with you. Okay, so getting into it here, this is the article I'm going to be referencing here. The context of this first initial part of this video is going to be catered towards the MSP and your own internal automations here. If you're a vendor, this can additionally be helpful because some of the prerequisite steps I'm going to be walking through are the same ones that you would need to direct an MSP to go and do. And so the other thing that I want to touch on here, that as far as the importance of all of this, is that as of today, Microsoft states that starting in May of 2022, they're going to begin transitioning you automatically from DAP to GDAP, which means that you're going to be placed in the predefined roles that they've selected. And I'll link those in here as well too, but effectively they're nowhere near what I would consider what an MSP would need in order to be able to support a managed service client within that environment. And there's certainly not enough probably for the automations that you want to do both as an MSP and as a vendor. So this is why I wanted to get ahead of this now and give you guys some video content, because whenever this does happen, if Microsoft actually holds to these timelines, is when everything's going to kind of hit the fan. Everything's going to start breaking, your automations are going to break, and then everybody's maybe going to gravitate towards this content. So if you're watching it afterwards, sorry that's happening, but hopefully this helps you out here as well too. So the steps here I've outlined, for everything that we're going to be doing here, but the service account is really what I recommend in creating specific for the automations. You really shouldn't be using a regular user as far as the actual integration user, the person that's going to get the authentication tokens that we're going to be using here for the access that we're going to grant. So there's three basic prerequisites for this particular user. One is that they need to be a global admin initially, and that's just for us to acquire the access tokens that we're going to be using in future steps. They don't have to be a perpetual global admin, which is why I recommend going in and setting them up as a PIM enabled user so that they're just eligible for the global admin role. You're still reducing your attack surface in a lot of these ways, and not keeping somebody as a perpetual global admin. So just keep that in mind. That user does have to have MFA, so whether that's through conditional access or through the per user MFA settings. It cannot also, as I mentioned here, be with a third-party provider like Duo. So you have to be using Microsoft's authentication for this as well. And then lastly, this user themselves needs to be added to the admin agents group in Azure AD. This comes into play a little bit later. I'll show you like a PowerShell error that you get if you do not add them to the Azure admin agents group here. It's very important that you do that, or else you won't be able to complete the later steps here in this video. But in this example, I used a account just called automations in my tenant, and this is within your partner tenant. And you added the global administration role. Again, if you're using PIM, you take the additional steps to go and configure PIM. And then I just opened up an incognito window and registered for multi-factor authentication. If you're an MSP, it's likely that you want to use the shared token within a documentation tool like IT Glue or Hoodoo, just so that you can maybe share that access with other users in the organization as far as the grant versus putting the MFA token or the MFA code solely on a single user's phone. And then setting up the app registration with the secure application model. This is something that you could do via a script. Kelvin over at CyberDrain definitely has been the biggest advocate and probably spread the most awareness around this through the secure application model and all the automation scripts he's created over the years. But you can actually also do this through the front end. So other than showing you these screenshots, let's go ahead and pivot into that admin center now so I can just show you that firsthand. Okay, so I'm here in the Entra Admin Center, and you're going to go under Applications here to App Registrations, and you can go ahead and create a new application registration. And in here, I'm just going to call this Automations 2 because I already named the one. You're going to make this a multi-tenant application, and then for the redirect URI, you just want to set up some type of local host. And you'll see this, it needs to be an open port locally to your device here for the purposes of what we're going to do as far as an example. If you have a more robust application, especially if you're a vendor, this would be a redirect back to your website that you're hosting here as well too. I'm not going to get through all the intricate details there because that's a whole different rabbit hole to go down. But I'll go to click on register here to create this application. And then there's a couple of things that you want to do here, one of which is to take note of your application ID. So just note what that is here, put in Notepad, something like that, along with your own tenant ID. You're going to need that here as well too for the scripts that we're going to be running. And then in the certificates and secrets section here, you're going to go in and you're going to create a new client secret. You can add whatever you'd like here. I'm just going to say SAM, Secure Application Model for the description. You can make it here as far as the length goes of the secret, however long you want. But obviously you just want to take note of that with some automation behind whenever you're going to update this. Max expiration is 2 years, just like the GDAP relationships. So I can click on add here. And then what you'll want to do is actually copy this value out of here as well. And once you do, after you exit this page, it will no longer be visible. So again, you want to store that in a secure location. Best practice is to store it in something like Azure Key Vault. Obviously, you could use your documentation tool as well too. That's a little bit more secure, but this is very important that you keep this in a very secure location. The next thing that we're going to do here is add all of our permissions. So if you're familiar with the secure application model, this is really where you're adding the levels of permission that can be granted within the rights that you're absorbing, as far as the API calls that you're able to make and what scopes you're applying to this as well too. So if you click on add a permission here, you'll want to go into Microsoft Graph. Is probably going to be one that you use the most as far as all the permissions goes. And I'm not going to go through all of these just because this is well outside the scope. But let's say you want to use an API call to read all devices within the organization. You would add this as part of the scope. I'm not going to get into delegated and application permissions because that's kind of outside the scope of this video for what I want to show. But this is how you add these here. If you want to add one also for organization or APIs that your organization uses, one of the ones that you'll want to add here is Microsoft Partner Center. And then you'll check off this user impersonation because we'll need that for the scripts that we're going to be running. And then another one that you might be using here is Office 365 Exchange Online. And for this one, you'll want to go into the delegated permissions, go under Exchange, and then go under Exchange.manage and click on Add Permissions here. So that'll get you access into the Exchange Online v3 commandlets if you're talking about PowerShell and the updated REST APIs that Microsoft has for that as well too, which a lot of people are going to access as part of the delegated rights, especially as an MSP. So I just want to take note of those because those are very important for the things that you're looking to do. The last thing you'll want to do here is grant consent. You do have to be logged in as a global admin for this to be able to work because the global admin has to grant consent on behalf for these permissions. When you're done though, you'll have a much larger, much more verbose list of application permissions most likely as far as everything that you want to set up here. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do here is make sure that our GDAP relationships are configured correctly and we have the necessary permissions here to be able to perform this on behalf of consent model so that we don't have to log in to each customer and grant access to our application for our automations. We'll go into the customer section here and you'll have your customer list. This is just my own demo environment, so don't have anything extensive, just have one customer here for demo purposes. But effectively here you can go into the administrator section here on the left, and this is where you can see your GDAP relationships today. So I'll click into the GDAP relationships I have for Novacoast. This is the GDAP relationship name. And I'll click into that, and underneath here I can see that I have this assigned to 2 security groups, and I can see all the the Azure AD roles that I've applied to this GDAP relationship. So the biggest thing here that you have to take in mind is that in order for us to perform this on behalf of consent model, we do have to establish at least one of 3 different roles as part of that relationship in order to be able to grant consent of our application as part of the customer that we manage in that GDAP relationship that we have. So those roles are the global admin role, the privileged role admin, or the cloud application admin role. Now, as far as best practices goes, what Microsoft would tell you is that you definitely should try to avoid adding the global administrator role wherever you can, and you can definitely do that in this use case as far as not having to add that to be able to perform these actions. I did so just as the example here though as well, but within this relationship here you can add security groups, and the important thing to note here is that you'll want to add a security group with the service account as a member of that particular security group because they need access to one of those roles in order for us to facilitate the scripts that we're going to run at a later point in time. That'll make more sense once we're actually doing that. But this is the GDAP SG1 security group that I have. And in part of this, as part of a member of this, I have the automations at T-, which I showed you at the beginning portion of this section. And this person has access, here to the application administrator, but the cloud app administrator role here and the global administrator role. As far as what we can do, best practice again would say that you would leave that off of there in the sense of what you need overall. But I do consider right now, at the state of what GDAP relationships are, there's a lot more considerations for global administrator at the end of the day that I'm not going to get into in this video again as well too. Just note that you have to have one of those three roles. The other consideration here is that in order to make specific API calls, we have to have access to certain workloads, meaning that if you have a API permission that you set at the application layer, that application registration that says, I want to be able to read all device configuration profiles in Intune, well, you need to have the Intune administrator role here, or something of greater value like global administrator would encompass everything, obviously, but that's, again, defeating the point of GDAP in a lot of ways. So it's just saying that you're mirroring the permissions. You know, if you have SharePoint API calls, then you need to have SharePoint administrator or something of that nature within here to be able to support them. So that's key to note here. So whatever you're doing with your automations, you want to have encompassed within the roles as part of the GDAP relationship, because those are going to be what's needed in order to absorb or basically make API calls against that user or that tenant, I should say. So that's a big deal. You know, these things have to be set up correctly, and the same is true if you're a vendor. You know, you need to instruct your MSP partner to go in and add the necessary permissions that will support your integration from an API perspective, if that makes sense as well too. So the next thing that we're going to do here, now that we have these things set up, is we're actually going to walk through the workflow in order to basically get an access token that we're going to use to then grant consent on behalf of our customers for this application registration that we set up. So in order to do that, we're acquiring this partner access token. This is, again, leveraging the secure application model, reference it here. And then I provide a sample script that you can use that leverages the Partner Center commandlets and the Partner Center module here. It is known that this might be degraded, or Microsoft might not be keeping up with the Partner Center module over time. So additionally, I also provided a sample just using the REST API. But still using PowerShell, just leveraging the direct endpoint versus the packaged commandlets and things like that in the module itself. So you could use either. In the sake of this example, I'm just going to use this. But here you can see that you're putting in the variables that you define as part of the app registration. So you're putting in your application ID, you're putting in your client secret, you're putting in your tenant ID, and then the application display name. So in my use case, it would be automations 2 that we referenced before. And the rest of this here, you know, it's just the plain sample text here. So I'm going to go ahead and put this into PowerShell, and then we'll see what the output looks like. So whenever you launch that, it's going to open up a browser window and you're going to be asked to sign in. This is where you just sign in with your service account that you created in that first steps that I mentioned here at the beginning of the video. So I'm going to use automations here, and then I'm going to sign in, and I'll approve the MFA request here. And then you get this message about authentication being complete. So we'll pivot back to PowerShell. And then so here we've accessed this partner token variable here that we can grab just to show you the example here. It's spitting out a refresh token, an ID token, and an access token. You want to take this refresh token and store it again in a very secure location like Azure Key Vault or something like that. That does expire every 90 days. So it is something that you have to go in and re-authenticate to get a new refresh token that you'll be able to use in your downstream scripts that you're leveraging, things like that. There's also very much scripts that you can use to automate that process as well too, which I'll link into the article as well. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to consent on behalf of our customers. So we're basically just going to show you an example, or I'm going to show you an example of doing one customer right now as far as just making sure this all works correctly. And then I'll give you a bulk script where you can loop through all of your customers and grant consent on behalf of everybody. So that way you can go back to just, you know, calling access tokens and being able to leverage automation scripts in your downstream customer tenants. So again, we'll copy this over. You just want to grab a tenant ID of a customer that you want to test here. And again, I'll pause briefly here while we just mock that up, and then we'll go through what that actually looks like. But effectively, just a quick note here, you're defining these samples, which is the application ID here for these enterprise application IDs, and these represent the scope workloads in Microsoft, or the API scopes that we're talking about here. So this is just a code for Graph API at the end of the day, if I could simplify it at that level. And this is a code for Microsoft Exchange. So we're just defining the grant scopes, and that again is coming back to our application registration and all those API permissions that we noted there. So as you notice here, I only have the 2, just as a reference in creating the application registration, but this is where you'd likely have a lot more based off of what you're doing from an automation perspective and comma separating those values in here. Okay, so here I've defined a customer tenant ID here, and then you're going to connect the Partner Center with this commandlet. If you don't have the Partner Center module installed, you'll want to just do install dash module, then Partner Center to be able to get that to come through if you're getting any errors about that. And then as you can see here, what I've defined is essentially something that I've already granted. So they're saying that this permission already exists. I'll show you what this looks like from a net new perspective as far as you've granted or you're going to grant the application registration consent for this particular tenant. Okay, coming back here, also wanted to reference that in doing this test, actually, of just being live here, I actually got this other error here, which was saying that property display name on the service principal does not match the application object, and realized they don't really like any type of space in between the name. So I just changed the name from automation space 2 to automations 2 with no space, and that was able to fix it here. So just reran that, and this is what you should get if you have a successful connection. This is referencing the application ID, the scopes that you provided as far as the application grants, and then that display name. And the big thing here is that you can actually visually see this in the downstream customer tenant by logging into their Entra Admin Center as well too. So let's pivot in there so I can show you what that looks like. Okay, so I'm in this tenant, Nova Coast School of Mines, and effectively I can go under the Enterprise Application section. And what you'll want to do is actually just mark out this filter for Enterprise Apps. And then you'll want to search for your automation 2, in this case is my name. And that you can actually see in here. It's created on 5/7, which is the date of which I just ran that script. And then in here, you can go under the permissions, and you can actually see the grants that we defined as part of our application grants as far as the consent goes. And so, you know, this is really the process that we're doing here to just basically still use the on behalf of consent model. We took those additional steps though from the GDAP permissions and the scoping there all the way through leveraging this new commandlet or API that Microsoft's created to perform this action. So again, back here on the documentation, again, I provided another REST sample in case you don't want to use the Power or the Partner Center module and commandlets. A couple of other things here to note. If you are getting this invalid application ID error and the application ID is absolutely 100% correct, it's likely that you're not using a more updated version of PowerShell. I did some like QA testing, and throughout the various versions, PowerShell version 3.0 is where I got this particular error. And effectively, I used PowerShell 7.0 for this latest example. The other one that I got here is this forbidden error. And that was in the use case of me not adding the user to the admin agents group. So this is why I was getting that outside of just troubleshooting everything else. Once I added them to the admin agents group, they were able to access that. The other reason that might be is they're not part of the security group that's assigned to the GDAP relationship with the customer, with at least, again, one of those 3 roles that I talked about, the global administrator, the privilege administrator, or the cloud app administrator role as part of that as well too. And then this is just going through and showing you, this is a success like we saw, and then validating that the application's been created in our customer environments. So the true, test out of this as well too is just basically being able to get a resource or an access token, I should say, into the client environment, and then being able to call an API request, in this case Microsoft Graph, that relates to the permissions that we set on that application registration. So I can go ahead and copy this right now, actually, without having to change any of these variables. I'll go back into PowerShell, just paste this in here. And then if I go to devices.value, or sorry, it's already defining that, so I'll just do devices. This is the API output, right? So this is all the devices within Nova Coast, and I'm able to grab that and get an access token based off of that application already being in there. If I hadn't done that, I would get an error that says that this tenant hasn't consented to your application, something along those lines. And you can see that a little bit more true. I show some, Postman requests, if you're familiar with Postman, using that to call APIs. But one of the ones here that I show, if I want to zoom in here, you'll be able to see it here. It says the user administrator has not consented to use the application with ID, and then it has the ID of the application and the application name. So this is what you would see either in Postman or through PowerShell if you were trying to do that and hadn't consented to the application yet. And then lastly here, from the standpoint of obviously we want to consent in bulk across all of our customers. There's a couple of different API calls or commandlets that you can use to get all of your customers and their tenant IDs within Partner Center. So these are the more common ones that people use today, list customers and list contracts. You also have this newer one here specifically that came out with GDAP. You do have to have a Microsoft Lighthouse license, which is free, but it does have to be in place for you able to call that API to get all the tenants with GDAP relationships that you have within your Partner Center environment. But then I just provided a sample script that basically just loops through all of your customers and does what we just did there, but just for each and every tenant that you have, if you wanted to do that. And then this is the REST API sample of that as well too, just doing it the same thing here at the end of the day, but just using the direct REST API calls versus the Partner Center commandlets or Partner Center module at the end of the day. And then the last point to make here before we pivot into the vendor section is that if you ever update your permissions on the app registration, as in you go in, you say, I add a permission for viewing device configurations, again, just to use that example because I didn't have that to begin with, you do have to remove consent and re-add it whenever that happens. So today you can leverage their API again to do that, and I've linked that here for you as well too, but you basically can't just add ad hoc without removing first and then re-adding. You'll constantly get an error message that says that the permissions already exist or this consent's already been granted. So that's just another consideration to have there for those things. And really, at the end of the day, this is everything that you need in order to be able to continue to perform automation. So just like 10,000 more steps here, obviously, that you have to take now. It is good in the sense that it's increasing our security still. It's the whole purpose of GDAP, is reducing our supply chain risks, things like that. And it does scope our permissions down a little bit more, but obviously there's a lot to consider here, which is why I made this blog and made this video. The second article here is specifically for vendors, and I'm not going to go as much depth here because there's a lot of similar prerequisite steps, then it's a lot more technical. If you think about the development that you're doing as a vendor to accommodate for this, I'm not going to walk through all that because that would take forever. But effectively, again, you as a vendor need to be educating your downstream partners, especially if you're leveraging an on behalf of or delegated access model for being able to call APIs in downstream customer environments for your partners. So if you are a vendor, just to clarify, if you're a vendor that doesn't use an on behalf of consent model and you just consent on a per tenant basis or per customer basis, GDAP doesn't affect you at all. You can continue to do that. You can continue to have these grants into those environments because that's an explicit consent model where you're actually logging in with the customer global admin credentials and consenting for the organization for your actual integration to work. So just take that in mind, but this is something, obviously I got to clean that up because that's not supposed to be there. But this is giving again more background on why the integration is breaking, which I covered at the beginning of the article. You do want to educate your partners and MSPs to create the service account specific for your integration. And this could be as simple as using this type of nomenclature where you have your company at mspdomain.com. And that's just something internal, but the same prerequisites are true. You know, they need to have it as a global admin. They can still PIM enable it for additional security. It needs to have MFA with Microsoft MFA, not third party. And it needs to be added to the admin agents group. Similar concepts as far as storing that in a documentation tool that's commonly used today. And then these same steps apply, you know, and there's nothing different about the GDAP relationships and the levels of permission. You just need to instruct the partner or the MSP on all the permissions that your app integration requires and educate them on what Azure AD roles they need to have as part of their GDAP relationships. That's the most explicit that you need to do. If you want to look at an example, the CIPP application from Kelvin has a great he's a front runner, I guess, in the sense of understanding this and building the integration before anybody, in my opinion. And he has great documentation on what to instruct for the MSP. But these are, again, steps that are required in order for this to be able to work with GDAP. So for you as a vendor, you really want to continue to use the secure application model, but really step through that in the front end is most desirable, I would say, for the MSP to follow in a wizard-like fashion, where they're authenticating, on behalf of the entire tenant, so that you can create an app registration into the partner tenant. You can get the security created as well too. You're storing the application ID and the secret on your side, and then you're using that to basically generate an authentication token or an access token, a refresh token that you're going to store as well too. So there's a lot more steps, in this sense that you would want to take to basically provide the best user experience, I would say. And then obviously you have to be very conscientious of the security around the things that you're storing on behalf of the partner, because these are the keys to the kingdom at the end of the day from what you can actually do. And again, I'll get to this in a minute. It's a little bit more scoped down than what it is today with traditional DAP, but you still have a ton of responsibility to make sure that these are being stored and encrypted in a secure location. You're going to get all the downstream customers for the MSP, again, leveraging similar API calls that I was showing on the MSP side of the house that gets all the tenant IDs that you'll use. And then you'll use that API, that we used in PowerShell, but just the straight REST API from Microsoft, and pass in the scope of what you're using for your integration as part of the body to loop through all of that and, consent on every single customer's behalf in those use cases. And then the one benefit to this, in the larger scheme of things, is that if you ever had to update your permissions, you can just programmatically reconsent for all the customers. From a security perspective, every time you updated permissions, I believe it would be best practice to inform the MSP that you're adding permissions or giving them an interface to explicitly grant the additional permission for all the downstream customers, or at least scope that to some, so that there is still this model of least privilege going on when we talk about the GDAP considerations and the levels of security. And then some of the other things that you have to obviously consider here is that this has to be dynamic, in the sense that the customer or the partner is going to continually potentially adding customers into their partner center environment. So you need to have an automated job or service that's going to constantly look for new tenant IDs and have some type of consent workflow, whether that's manual intervention from the MSP, whether they opt in for you to automatically consent your application for every customer that they onboard. It's up to you. I think I would provide both, as far as the best experience goes. And then since you're basically managing the refresh tokens for the partner, you need to have a job that continuously goes in and refreshes those with an automated job. And here's a sample to go do so. So there's a lot, that is required from an overhead perspective, but it truly does provide a very clean, user interface for the automations that you may want to do on behalf of all their customers. I made a note here, though, about security considerations, because it is very important when we talk about the levels of access that you have. Not that they're more than what you are using today with DAP, in the sense of your own application having a secret in there and things of that nature. But encryption is table stakes. Access controls are table stakes when it comes to accessing the secrets that you're storing, because those can be, if they were breached, they can cause downstream effects and supply chain attacks, which is really what GDAP's here to prevent. So it's best, to have obvious best practices about this. And then I think it also brings up the question of both you as a vendor and also as an MSP, some of the pros and cons of the on behalf of model and the per tenant model. So I kind of outline that here as well too. And effectively, what I'm basically describing here is that, as for the pros of the consent on behalf model, as a vendor and as an MSP, your onboarding time is at a minute fraction of the time it would take if you had to consent on a per customer basis. If you think about it, if you're an MSP with 1,000 customers, you'd have to sign in to every single customer to grant consent to the vendor's application. And then whenever they update their permissions at any time, you'd have to redo that whole process. So it's a lot of friction. It can significantly reduce onboarding time And so the pro of it, having this automated on behalf of workflow is that you're providing them just, an interface that might take them about 10 minutes to walk through, if that, and they're signing in with one service account, and effectively then you're automating the rest of the process from there, for them on their behalf. So it's a lot better onboarding experience. Again, it's a common chicken and the egg problem of less time, more security in a lot of ways here. And then as a vendor, I talked about this, reconsenting across all customers again. Some of the cons, about adopting the consent on behalf model is that you truly have to embrace everything GDAP. Whereas if you're just doing on a per tenant basis, you don't have any concerns over GDAP. It's explicit consent, direct to customer. So there's not any of this delegated rights that you have to think about. And at the end of the day, you could actually experience a better customer experience, because I guarantee you, there's going to be a lot of friction with all the steps that you have to take here in order for this integration to work. You could try to automate a lot of these steps for the MSP, especially with GDAP relationships, because there's APIs there as well too. But you're getting into a lot of overhead, when you talk about that, as far as everything that you want to actually maintain to make this a better experience and reduce your help desk calls. And then that leads to the last point of overhead in general, because when you think about supporting this model, instead of just having an interface where somebody grants consent to your application on a per tenant basis and just signs in, you're having to create all this new infrastructure for managing the secrets, creating specific workflows for the authentication, storing the refresh tokens, regenerating the refresh tokens, and then having a job for the consent API, for the dynamic changes that are going on in the environments that you're managing as well here too. So there's definite big pros and cons on each side of the house. I think it's really hard area to navigate, just because everybody that comes onto your product is, especially if they're not conscious of security or even minutely technical at all, it's going to be like a big hurdle to get them consenting on every single customer layer for them to use your product, especially if that's your main core value add. So if it's just something I would weigh as a company, and dictate that, but always lead with security. Especially if you're going to do on behalf of consent, it's talking about the ways in which you're protecting the secrets that you store, the ways in which you authenticate, the access controls internally that you have for those types of things, because I think it's going to be wildly beneficial. Okay guys, that's everything I have for you in today's video. I know this was a longer one and much more challenging from a technical perspective, so I appreciate you guys hanging on. If you're still watching at this point in time, definitely check out the blog a little bit more in depth, and feel free to comment below with any questions or comments that you might have about the content that I covered today. And additionally, if you'd like some more targeted consulting, I'll link up the blog post to reach out to me there, so we can see if maybe that might be a good fit. As always, like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, definitely like and subscribe if you guys want to see more content around Microsoft and the MSP space. Thanks, guys. Have a great day.